Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. Hawaii does not look like a place where darkness lives. It looks like a postcard, the kind of image you hang on a wall to remind yourself that beauty exists in the world. The mountains rise green and ancient over the island of Oahu, draped in mist and silence, their trails winding through dense forest canopy, where the air smells of rain and earth and something impossibly fresh. For most of the people who walk those paths, the experience is one of wonder. But on the morning of March 24th, 2025, on a narrow hiking trail known as the Palipuka, northeast of Honolulu, that wonder shattered into something that would eventually fill a courtroom and leave an entire country asking how a man who had sworn an oath to preserve life had allegedly come to the edge of ending one. At 47 years old, Koenig was a doctor, specifically an anesthesiologist, the kind of physician whose work happens quietly and invisibly, ensuring that patients feel nothing, that pain is held at bay, that the human body passes safely through the terrifying threshold of surgery. He had been an anesthesiologist at UPMC, one of the most respected hospital systems in the United States, and had served as an assistant professor of anesthesiology and bioengineering at the University of Pittsburgh. At some point in the years before 2025, he and his family had relocated to Maui, Hawaii, where he worked with the Anesthesia Medical Group, providing services to Maui health facilities. On paper, he was the kind of man a community felt fortunate to have, educated, accomplished, trusted with lives in their most vulnerable moments. His wife, Ariel Koenig, was 37 years old. She shared her life with Gerhard in Maui, and together they had built a family. 2 young children, ages 3 and 5, whose small, bright presence filled the spaces of a life that, from the outside, looked whole and charmed. Ariel was not simply a background figure in that life. She had her own career, her own colleagues, her own sense of self. Sometime in late 2024, approximately 3 months before the hike, Gerhard Koenig discovered that his wife had been having what she would later describe as an emotional affair with a colleague, a man she worked with, a man who was himself married. Ariel has been clear on one point. The affair never became physical. It was emotional, a connection forged in conversation, in the intimacy of shared work and shared moments, in the kind of closeness that does not require physical contact to wound the person on the outside looking in. But to Gerhard, the discovery was catastrophic. He became consumed by jealousy, accusing her with rage and bitterness, demanding she quit her job so she would no longer be near the man he considered her betrayer. The couple sought help. They enrolled in marriage counseling. They tried to do the hard, slow work of rebuilding trust. By all outward appearances, they were trying. March 24th, 2025 was Ariel Koenig's birthday. Gerhard had planned the day himself, a hike along the Palipuka Trail, a winding path through the lush mountains northeast of Honolulu, overlooking the Nuuanu Pali, a dramatic stretch of ancient cliffside where Hawaiian history runs as deep as the valleys below. Ariel had never hiked this trail before. It was a gift, an experience, a gesture that carried the particular weight of a husband trying to offer something meaningful to a wife whose trust he was trying to recover. She accepted it as such. They set out together on the morning of her birthday, into the green and misty mountains, with their marriage suspended somewhere between broken and mended. The trail itself is not a gentle walk. The terrain along the Palipuka is rugged, tree canopy thick overhead, the ground muddy and slippery in the wet season, sheer drops visible at certain points where the mountain falls away into open air. As they walked, something began to shift. She grew uncomfortable as the trail took them closer to the cliff edge. She did not want to go further. When Gerhard suggested they take a selfie together with the cliff as the dramatic backdrop behind them, she told him she didn't feel comfortable being that close to the edge. She asked him to move aside so she could pass him and step back from the precipice. It was a simple, reasonable request. The request of a woman who did not want to stand on the lip of a mountain. What happened next was not the response of a man who merely disagreed. Gerhardt grabbed her by the upper arms. He began pushing her backward, toward the cliff, toward the place where the mountain ended and the sky began. She told the court he was shouting, something like, "Get back over there. I'm so sick of you." His voice stripped of anything gentle, carrying the kind of fury that lives beneath months of festering grievance. She realized, in the space of a few terrible seconds, that he was not joking. She made a decision in that moment that may have saved her life. She dropped to the ground. She grabbed onto nearby foliage, the bushes and undergrowth clinging to the mountainside, and she held on. But Gerhardt Koenig did not stop. He climbed on top of her, pinning her to the ground on the narrow, muddy trail. And then he produced a syringe. Ariel told the court she saw it in his hand, a medical syringe, the kind that a man with his training would know exactly how to use. He told her to stay still. She refused. She fought back with everything she had, screaming, biting, fighting against a man who outweighed her on a mountain where no one was supposed to hear. He told her, according to her testimony, that no one was coming to save her. "Nobody's coming to save you." She pleaded with him. She invoked their children, those two young faces waiting somewhere below, and asked him to think about what he was doing and what it would mean for them. For a moment he hesitated. Then he picked up a rock. It was a lava rock, the kind that makes up the bones of the Hawaiian Islands, dark and dense and brutally hard. He struck her with it, not once, not twice, approximately 10 times. He hit her across the head while grabbing the back of her hair, and at points, prosecutors alleged, he smashed her face into the ground. The violence was not the brief, reactive violence of a sudden quarrel. It was sustained. It was repeated. It was the kind of violence that does not stop easily on its own. It stopped because of two strangers. Amanda Morris and Sarah Buxbaum were hiking the Polypuka Trail that same morning, friends who had come to the mountains for the kind of uncomplicated peace that a beautiful day in Hawaii offers. They heard a sound that did not belong in that peace. A woman's voice, raw and desperate, cutting through the canopy. "Help! Help me!" Amanda and Sarah ran toward the voice, toward the sound, not away from it, a choice that required a courage most people never have to demonstrate. What they found when they arrived was Ariel Koenig on her back, bloodied, with a man above her. One of the witnesses, Sarah Buxbaum, later testified that when she looked at Gerhardt Koenig in that moment, his eyes were cold. Not frantic, not wild with remorse, but cold. Sarah placed the 911 call. In the recording played for the jury, the two hikers could be heard describing what they were seeing. A woman with a bloodied face, a man with a rock. Gerhardt Koenig froze. Whether it was the presence of witnesses, the sound of the 911 call, or something else entirely, he stopped. Ariel found her way to the women. Together, the three of them began to make their way down the trail toward the officers who were already moving up to meet them. Officer Kevin Chung of the Honolulu Police Department was among the first to reach them. He saw three women descending the trail, Amanda, Sarah, and Ariel, and took statements from the witnesses on the scene. The body camera footage from an officer who arrived at the scene was later played for the jury at trial. It showed the moments immediately after Ariel emerged from the mountain, her injuries visible, her account urgent and raw. Ariel was transported to a hospital, where she was treated by an acute care surgeon. She had suffered severe scalp lacerations. Her thumb was fractured. Her face bore the marks of what had been done to it. A CT scan would later confirm there was no skull fracture, but the wounds to her scalp were documented and photographed, the images shown to the jury in an Oahu courtroom more than a year later. Gerhardt Koenig, meanwhile, had fled into the mountains. Law enforcement searched the terrain. Officer Alan Oka canvassed the area. Drones were deployed, and the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources sent officers to search through the dense, muddy, canopied trail. The tree cover was thick. Conditions were difficult. He was eventually located near Poly Highway and taken into custody. Notably, investigators never recovered his phone, Ariel's purse, any vials, or the syringes Ariel had described. He was booked and charged with second-degree attempted murder. Within days, a judge held him without bail following a grand jury indictment. A restraining order was granted by the court, forbidding him from contacting his wife or returning to the family home. Ariel moved forward with divorce proceedings. In her filing, she described a marriage that had, for some time, carried a hidden violence, allegations of sexual abuse and assault that preceded March 24, 2025, and that now formed part of the legal record of their relationship. Gerhard Koenig entered a plea of not guilty to the charge in April 2025. His attorney, Thomas Otaki, built a defense around 3 words: unfaithful, unwilling, and untrue. The defense's position was direct and pointed. Ariel had been unfaithful to her husband. She was unwilling to accept responsibility for the damage that betrayal had caused, and the story she was telling was untrue. Otaki argued that what occurred on the Pali Puka Trail was not premeditated attempted murder, but a chaotic confrontation that Ariel had initiated. The defense claimed that it was Ariel, not Gerhard, who had first struck him with a rock, and that Gerhard had hit her back in an act of self-defense. They pointed to photographs taken after the incident showing Gerhard with bruising on his face as evidence that the violence had not been entirely one-sided. The defense also attacked a specific element of the prosecution's case with pointed scrutiny. Prosecutors claimed that Gerhard Koenig had, in a phone call from jail, confessed to his son that he had tried to kill Ariel, but that she had gotten away. According to the state, he told his son during that call that Ariel had been cheating on him for months, and that the attack was connected to that betrayal. The defense disputed this characterization entirely, arguing that no such confession had been made, and that any attempt to frame that conversation as an admission of guilt was a misreading. Gerhard Koenig was seen crying during opening statements, his composure collapsing at moments as the weight of the proceedings pressed down on him in the courtroom. The prosecution's case rested on multiple pillars. There were the 2 eyewitnesses who had heard screaming and run toward it, who had seen a man with a rock and a bloodied woman beneath him, who had not hesitated to call for help. There was the body camera footage, shown to the jury for the first time during the trial, capturing the scene with the unblinking precision that only technology provides. There was Ariel's own testimony, delivered over hours in the Oahu courtroom, during which she described the selfie request, the cliff edge, the grab, the syringe, the rock, and during which she also admitted, under cross-examination, to the emotional affair she had carried on with her colleague. She acknowledged the damage it had done. She acknowledged that Gerhardt's discovery of it had fractured their marriage. She conceded that in the days before the trial, she had moved money from the couple's joint account into one bearing only her name. The defense used each of these admissions as tools to chip at her credibility, to suggest that the woman on the stand was not simply a victim, but a complicated participant in a story whose edges were less clean than the prosecution wanted the jury to believe. And yet, the medical record remained. The photographs remained. The witnesses remained. Sarah Buxbaum, who had stood on that trail in the mountains of Oahu and watched a woman crawl toward her with blood on her face, remained. She had described, in a courtroom a year later, what she had seen in the eyes of the man standing over that woman. Not panic, not remorse, not the face of a person acting out of fear. A cold look. That is the phrase that entered the record and settled there, difficult to dislodge. The trial began on March 19, 2026, nearly a year to the day after the attack on Ariel Koenig's birthday. As of the final days of March 2026, it was still in progress, witnesses being called, evidence being examined, arguments being made about what it means when a man with medical training carries syringes to a mountain trail, and what it means when a woman survives. Gerhard Koenig, who once put people to sleep so surgeons could save them, sat in a courtroom in Honolulu and listened as the state laid out its case that he had tried, on a green Hawaiian mountain on his wife's birthday, to ensure that she would never wake up. His defense maintained that he was an innocent man, falsely accused by a wife with reasons of her own. The jury listened. Outside, somewhere below those ancient cliffs, the mountains of Oahu stood as they always have, silent, indifferent to what human beings do to one another in their shadows. Story 2. The city of Payu sits in the northwestern corner of Gyeonggi Province, South Korea, pressed up against the border that has divided the Korean peninsula for more than 7 decades. It is a city of contrasts, ancient fortresses and modern apartment complexes, quiet riverbanks where herons stand motionless in shallow water, and wide roads humming with the movement of commuters between Seoul and the provincial towns beyond. It is not a city that appears in international headlines. It goes about its business without much announcement, as most cities do, its residents waking and working and returning home with the rhythm of ordinary life. In the summer of 2022, inside an apartment in Payu, something happened that would shatter that ordinariness entirely, and that would not fully come to light until the dead of winter, when a drunk driver struck a taxi on a dark road and opened a door that exposed a darkness far more terrifying than anyone on that road could have imagined. Lee Kyung was 31 years old in the summer of 2022. He was not an invisible man. He had a face that police would later publish, a driver's license photograph that was released to the public under a procedure so rare in South Korea that its use alone signaled the gravity of what he had done. South Korean law protects the identities of criminal suspects with unusual care. The decision to name and photograph a suspect is reserved for crimes of exceptional severity. Lee Kyung met that standard. He had also, in the years before the summer of 2022, accumulated a record of criminal driving offenses, including multiple drunk driving convictions that had cost him his license in January 2019. He drove anyway. He had always, it seemed, operated by rules he made for himself, discarding the ones the rest of the world agreed to follow. Living with him in the apartment in Payu was a woman, Ms. Wu, a woman in her early 50s, a decade and a half older than Lee. She had opened her home to him in the way that people do when they believe in someone, when they see a future in a relationship that friends and family might question, but that feels, from the inside, real and worth protecting. She was also, in a legal and financial sense, Lee's landlady. The apartment he occupied was registered in her name, and the arrangement between them carried the particular vulnerability of someone whose home and heart were entangled with the same person. She trusted him with her space, her finances, and her life. In the end, she paid for that trust with everything she had. The weeks before August 3rd, 2022, Lee Kyung had been searching for on the internet in the time leading up to that day. He had typed the words pesticides that make you die into a search engine. He had searched for methods of obtaining and using poison. When those methods proved inaccessible, when the path he had initially envisioned closed before him, he did not stop. He simply adapted. He chose a different instrument. He chose blunt force. The planning was never in doubt. The search history was the mind of a man walking toward murder while appearing to stand still. On the afternoon of August 3rd, 2022, in the main room of the apartment they shared, Lee Kyung attacked Ms. Wu with a blunt object. He struck her on the head and body 10 times. 10 times. A number that speaks not to suddenness or surprise, but to sustained, deliberate violence, to a determination to ensure that what he had begun would end only one way. Ms. Wu, a woman in the early 50 years of a life she had built carefully and lived quietly, died in the room of her own apartment. After she was gone, Lee sat in the space where she had fallen. Then he picked up her mobile phone. The phone was locked. He had anticipated this too. He had searched, in the days before the murder, for methods to unlock mobile phones without a passcode, a piece of digital knowledge that served no innocent purpose in the context of everything else he had done. He unlocked her phone. He went into her banking applications. He withdrew the entirety of her savings. He used her credit cards. He drained the financial architecture of her life with the same methodical precision with which he had ended it. Then, the following day, August 4th, he placed her body into a car roof bag, the kind of waterproof cargo bag that travelers strap to their vehicles, and drove to the banks of Gongneungcheon Stream in Payu. He disposed of her body there, in the reeds and silt beside the moving water. Then he drove home. In the days and weeks that followed, Lee Kyung returned to the apartment. He picked up Ms. Wu's phone and sent messages to her family and acquaintances, impersonating her, creating the illusion, for anyone who loved her, that she was still alive, still busy, still simply unavailable for a visit or a phone call. He made sure no one came looking too soon. Meanwhile, he used her credit cards until their limits were exceeded. In November 2022, 3 months after her death, he forged a real estate sales contract in her name and attempted to transfer the legal ownership of the apartment to himself. He borrowed 10 million won from his own father, using the forged document as collateral, the fraud compounding quietly in the background of a life that showed the world nothing out of the ordinary. Lee extracted from Ms. Wu's financial existence more than 81 million won stolen from the woman whose home he had shared and whose life he had taken. And then came December. The night of December 20th, 2022, in the northwestern city of Goyang, adjacent to Payu, the streets darkened, the winter air sharp with cold, the late-night roads quieter than the hours before rush hour but never truly empty. Lee Kyung was driving. He should not have been. His license had been revoked since 2019. He had been convicted of drunk driving multiple times. On this particular night, he was again under the influence of alcohol when his vehicle struck a taxi cab driven by a man in his late 50s. A professional driver who had been on the road earning his living in the way that taxi drivers do, making passage possible for other people in the dark hours of the night. The collision was not minor. There was damage. There was liability. There was a man standing beside his taxi who had every right to call the police and report what had happened. Lee Kyung told the taxi driver not to call the police. He told him that if he came with him to his apartment in Payu, he would pay in full, a large cash settlement, compensation for the damage, money to cover every cost the accident had created. It was a practical offer, the kind that a working driver, weighing the inconvenience of a police report against the simplicity of a cash payment, might consider reasonable. The driver agreed. They drove to Payu together. The taxi driver, whose name has been withheld in most reports out of respect for his family, walked through the door of the same apartment where, for months earlier, Ms. Wu had taken her last breath. He had no way of knowing that. He had no way of knowing anything about the man who had just offered him money and hospitality. He was simply trying to get paid for the damage done to his car and get back on the road. Then an argument broke out inside the apartment. A dispute over the terms of the settlement, a conversation that escalated. The taxi driver was killed with a blunt weapon, the violence again concentrated and deliberate. His body was not disposed of at a riverbank this time. Lee placed it inside a closet in the apartment and closed the door. Then he did what he had done in August. He took the man's mobile phone, unlocked it, searched his banking details, and began extracting whatever financial value remained in his victim's life. In 5 days between the murder and Lee's arrest, he extracted approximately 55 million won from the taxi driver's financial accounts through loans taken out in the driver's name by non-face-to-face banking methods that the unlocked phone made possible. He was methodical in this too. He had practiced it before. The taxi driver's disappearance was noticed. He had a family, a route, a schedule, the kind of predictable daily presence that becomes conspicuous by its absence. When he did not return home, and when the messages coming from his phone seemed inconsistent with his voice and habits, concern turned into alarm. A missing persons report was filed. Investigators began looking. They traced the last known movements of the taxi driver and found, through cell phone records and traffic camera footage, the collision on December 20th and the subsequent journey to Payu. The evidence led, with the clarity of a thread pulled through a maze, to Lee Kyung's apartment. Lee Kyung was arrested in late December 2022. When police brought him in for questioning about the taxi driver's death, something happened that the investigators did not expect. Something that transformed the case from a single murder inquiry into the revelation of a darkness that had been concealed for 5 months. As he was being questioned about the events of December 20th, Lee Kyung confessed to the murder of Ms. Wu. He told them about August 3rd. He told them about the blunt object and the 10 blows and the car roof bag. He told them where he had left her, beside Gongnung Stream in Payu. He had carried the knowledge of that first murder through 4 months of ordinary life, through the forgeries, through the financial fraud, through the Christmas season and the cold nights in an apartment where a dead man lay in his closet. He had carried it, and now he set it down. Police immediately launched a search for Ms. Wu's body, deploying officers, divers, and helicopters to comb the banks and waters of Gongnung Stream. The search proved extraordinarily difficult. Lee had given multiple conflicting accounts of exactly where he had left her, first saying he had thrown the body into the stream, and then changing his story to say he had buried it on the riverbank. The shifting accounts delayed the search significantly, prolonging the agony of her family during the weeks of the Lunar New Year holiday, as police continued their painstaking work through the cold winter landscape of Payu. The body was eventually located. What investigators found confirmed in physical, irrefutable terms everything that Lee had described about the manner of her death. On December 28, 2022, the Gyeonggi Bukbu Provincial Police Agency made the decision, extraordinary and deliberate, to publicly reveal the identity of the suspect. South Korean law ordinarily shields the names of criminal suspects from public disclosure, a protection designed to prevent prejudice before conviction. The exceptions are reserved for crimes considered highly condemnable, where sufficient evidence exists, and where the public has a compelling interest in knowing who is being held. Lee Ki-young met every one of those criteria. The agency released his name, his age, and his driver's license photograph. Notably, he had consented to the release himself, a gesture that those watching the case found difficult to interpret, but that added another strange dimension to a personality that seemed to operate by its own internal logic. In January 2023, the full weight of the legal system descended. The Wujongba District Prosecutor's Office issued a formal indictment against Lee Ki-young on charges of murder, concealment of dead bodies, robbery with homicide, revenge killing, fraud, and falsification of documents. Alongside the criminal charges, the prosecution had also ordered a psychological evaluation to better understand the man at the center of these crimes. The findings were deeply unsettling. The evaluation concluded that Lee Ki-young had egocentric and antisocial personality traits and demonstrated a pronounced inability to regulate his emotions. More significantly, the evaluation found that he presented a high risk of reoffending, that the psychological architecture that had produced these murders was structural, not situational, not the product of a single bad moment or an impossible circumstance. It was simply the shape of who he was. The digital evidence marshaled by prosecutors told a story so detailed it left almost no room for doubt. The internet searches before Ms. Wu's death, pesticides that make you die, how to unlock cell phones, were timestamps of intent. The searches conducted immediately after the murder, Payu corpse, Gongneung stream water flow direction, were the calculations of a man solving a logistical problem. Together, they sketched the contours of a mind that had approached two separate human lives as problems to be managed and resources to be harvested. In the final hearing of the trial, at the Wujongba District Court in Goyang on April 12, 2023, prosecutors stood before the court and demanded the death penalty. Their argument was unsparing. Lee admits his wrongdoing, they told the court, but his crime, which involves enjoying an extravagant life off of the victim's money, is unforgivable. They accused him of selfish behavior, of acting, even after the murders and the arrests and the indictments, as though he himself were the aggrieved party, the one who deserved sympathy. Lee Ki-young, for his part, told the court he had no excuse for what he had done and asked the judge to impose a heavy sentence. His attorney requested a delay to allow time to compensate the victims' families. The court weighed it all: the confessions, the forensic evidence, the digital trail, the psychological evaluation, the financial crimes, the bodies. On May 19, 2023, the Goyang branch of the Wujongba District Court delivered its judgment. Lee Ki-young was sentenced to life in prison. The court declined to impose the death penalty, but did not temper its language. In its ruling, the court stated that Lee had meticulously planned the murder and subsequent crimes and had continued with the planned murder without any hesitation. He was additionally ordered to wear a GPS-equipped electronic monitoring anklet for 30 years upon any future release. A sentence within a sentence, a leash of technology to account for what the psychological evaluation had determined was a genuine and ongoing danger to society. The families of both victims now carry something that no verdict can fully address: the knowledge of what the last hours of their loved ones' lives looked like, in an apartment in Payu, in the company of a man who had decided, calmly, searchingly, methodically, that the lives of other human beings were instruments in his own story. Ms. Wu, who had opened her home to someone she trusted, was found beside a stream. The taxi driver, who had simply asked to be compensated for damage done to his car, never came home. Their families waited through winter searches and delayed trials and the grinding machinery of justice, and at the end of it, they received a life sentence for a man who is now 32 years old, and who will grow old inside the walls of a South Korean prison, wearing an anklet that will follow him wherever he goes, carrying the record of everything he planned, searched for, and did, preserved in the permanent memory of the courts and the country that tried him. Story 3. The small town of Winlock, Washington sits quietly in Lewis County, tucked between rolling hills and patches of evergreen forest in the southwestern corner of the state. It is the kind of town where neighbors know each other's names, where the pace of life moves slowly enough that unusual silences get noticed, and where a door left unanswered for too long eventually becomes a cause for worry. In early 2025, that worry crept across Byham Road like a slow winter fog, and when it finally lifted, it revealed one of the most disturbing crimes the community had ever faced. A double murder that had lain hidden behind locked doors for more than 3 weeks while the world outside went on living, unaware that 2 of its own were gone. Donald J. Piccolo was 61 years old, a man whose life had settled into the quiet rhythms of later years. He had medical appointments to keep and people who cared enough to drive him to them. Kimberly R. Torres was 51, a woman who had built a life around the humble but important routines of home. The two shared a residence on Byham Road, and together they formed a small household in a small town. 2 people who, by all accounts, were known to their community and connected to the lives around them. They were not the kind of people who disappeared without anyone noticing. And yet, for more than 20 days, no one knew that their lives had come to a violent and devastating end inside their own home. Their home was not entirely private. It was, in a sense, a place of casual traffic. A man named Robert Eugene Chandler, 35 years old, and from the Toledo area of Lewis County, had formed a habit of visiting their residence approximately 3 times a week. His visits had a simple, practical purpose. He used their home to take a shower. Chandler was not a man of stable circumstances. He had a history of erratic behavior, substance use, and a criminal record that stretched back years. People around him knew him, recognized him, and in many cases had learned to be wary of him. He huffed gas canisters, witnesses would later tell detectives, and after doing so, he became violent. He had screamed at trees. He had thrown items and yelled at people who were not there. He was a troubled man in a fragile mental state, living on the margins, relying on the goodwill of people like Donald and Kimberly for something as basic as a place to wash up. On January 31st, 2025, Kimberly Torres was seen in public for the last time. A few days later, on February 3rd, she made a purchase. The receipt found later in her purse would mark the final known trace of her ordinary life. The following day, February 4th, was the last day Donald Piccolo was seen alive. A relative had taken him to and from a medical appointment, the kind of small, routine errand that people make without thinking it might be the last. After that appointment, Donald returned home. What happened next would not be known to the outside world for nearly a month. On that same February 4th, Robert Chandler was seen in the vicinity of the neighborhood. A man who knew Chandler spotted him acting strangely near his property, and, wanting to remove him from the area, offered him a ride. Chandler asked to be taken to the residence of Torres and Piccolo. He said he wanted to take a shower. The driver obliged. Chandler was dropped at the door, and that was the last anyone outside that house saw of what happened within it. Later that day, a woman went to the residence to check on the occupants. She knocked on the door. From inside, she heard a voice, a male voice, pitched unnaturally high, calling out housekeeping in a tone that did not fit the moment. The door never opened. The woman, uneasy but uncertain, would later tell detectives that the voice sounded like Robert Chandler's. She had known him long enough to recognize it, though she could not be entirely sure. The detail would later prove critical. Someone was inside that house, and they were not answering. Days passed, then weeks. The people who knew Torres and Piccolo tried reaching out. Phone calls went unanswered. Visits to the door yielded no response. The house sat silent. But life in a small town carries its own momentum. People assumed explanations, told themselves there was probably a reason, and moved on with their days. Still, the silence gnawed at those closest to the 2 residents. At least 2 people attempted contact in the days after February 4th, and both were met with nothing but the blank face of a closed door. Meanwhile, Robert Chandler resurfaced in the community. Between February 7th and February 27th, witnesses observed him behaving in ways that struck them as deeply alarming. On February 7th, near the Cowlitz River, he was seen whipping his shirt and backpack against a rock, screaming at things no one else could see. On February 27th, he was seen spending hours yelling at trees, acting with what witnesses described as outright violence. The behavior was disturbing even by the standards of a man whose instability was already known. Something had shifted. Something was different. On the night of February 25th, almost 3 weeks after Donald Piccolo's last medical appointment, someone finally made a formal request for law enforcement to check on the welfare of the 2 residents at Byham Road. Winlock Police Chief Stephen Valentine responded. He approached the house. He knocked. There was no answer. He tried again and again. Every window was closed. Every door was locked. The home had the sealed, impenetrable quality of a place that did not want to be entered. Ultimately, Chief Valentine made the decision that had to be made. He forced entry. What he found inside that residence would mark the beginning of an investigation that would shake the entire community of Lewis County. Donald Piccolo was seated on the couch directly in front of the door, as though waiting. Kimberly Torres was on the floor, leaning against another couch. Both had been there for weeks. The decomposition was severe, but beneath the passage of time, the evidence of what had been done to them was unmistakable and deeply disturbing. The violence visited upon these 2 people was of a kind that went far beyond anything the ordinary mind wants to contemplate. Both had defensive wounds on their hands and forearms, signs that they had tried, in their final moments, to protect themselves. Both had ultimately failed. Investigators arrived, and the house was transformed into a crime scene. 2 swords were found, both bearing blood. Blood had sprayed across the ceiling and throughout the residence. The Lewis County Coroner's Office began the careful work of identifying the victims and determining cause of death. Autopsies confirmed what the scene already suggested. The deaths were homicides, inflicted with extreme and deliberate force. The manner in which they died was documented in clinical court language that still could not conceal the horror of what had occurred on February 4th in that quiet house on Byham Road. Detectives from the Lewis County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation. They began retracing the last known movements of Torres and Piccolo. They identified the timeline. They gathered statements. And very quickly, the name Robert Eugene Chandler began to emerge from witness accounts and physical evidence alike. Multiple people began mentioning Chandler in connection with the crime, each adding a small piece to a picture that was growing clearer by the day. Body camera footage from a police encounter with Chandler earlier on February 4th showed him wearing clothing that matched the description of a male seen on surveillance video approaching the victim's residence on the same day. When detectives returned to the house for a thorough search, they found, underneath the area where Kimberly Torres' body had been, clothing that belonged to Robert Chandler. They also found a Quest card bearing his signature and a Department of Corrections identification card that an officer confirmed had been personally handed to Chandler just days before the killings. Each piece of evidence tightened the frame around him. And then came the telephone call. On March 5th, Chandler was arrested, not for murder, but for a violation of his Department of Corrections supervision conditions. It was, according to court documents, a coincidental arrest. He was booked into the Lewis County Jail. Detectives took the opportunity to interview him about the murders. Chandler admitted to having been dropped off at the victim's residence on February 4th. He denied any involvement in the killings. But that same day from the jail, he placed a phone call to his mother. He asked her to wash the clothes in his backpack. He asked her to charge his phone. He told her he would be getting out soon. Law enforcement obtained a warrant and went to his mother's residence. The backpack was there. The clothing was retrieved. It had apparent bloodstains on it. Robert Eugene Chandler was charged on March 10th, 2025, in Lewis County Superior Court with 2 counts of first-degree aggravated murder. The charge is Washington State's most serious category of offense, carrying a maximum penalty of life in prison without the possibility of parole or release. At his preliminary hearing, judge imposed a no-bail hold after citing the extreme brutal nature of the alleged murders. Chandler, against the explicit advice of his attorney and the presiding judge, chose to speak out in court and assert his innocence. By the time you find out who really did it, he said with an air of certainty that struck those present as chilling, you're really going to be kicking yourselves. Deputy Prosecutor Brandy Archer described the allegations as frightening and incredibly concerning. The community of Winlock in Lewis County, now fully aware of what had happened on Byham Road, could only agree. But the path to justice, it turned out, would not be swift or simple. Within days of his charging, the court ordered a competency evaluation to determine whether Chandler was capable of understanding the proceedings against him and of assisting in his own defense. The evaluation was filed on March 31st, and its conclusions were stark. A licensed psychologist from the state's Department of Health and Social Services diagnosed Chandler with an unspecified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorder, alongside inhalant use disorder. She found that, at that time, Chandler lacked the mental capacity to proceed to trial. The road to restoring that competency was complicated by Chandler's own resistance. He was sent to Western State Hospital for treatment, including psychotropic medication. He refused. The court granted an involuntary medication order on April 24th, finding that treatment was both medically appropriate and necessary, that it would serve the state's interests in prosecuting the case, and that it would not interfere with his ability to assist his attorneys. Under that order, he received treatment. By July 7th, a forensic evaluator concluded that Chandler had experienced significant symptom reduction and now had the capacity to understand the nature of the proceedings against him. On July 17th, Judge J. Andrew Toynbee declared him competent to stand trial. Within days, through his defense attorney, Chandler entered a formal written plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, a plea that placed his mental state at the time of the alleged killings at the very center of whatever courtroom battle would follow. His defense attorney, Don Blair, subsequently waived Chandler's right to a speedy trial and obtained expert services to analyze Chandler's sanity at the time of the offenses. The financial cost of those services, declared by the court to be payable by Lewis County on the grounds of Chandler's indigence, was capped at $7,200. The case, with its profound weight and complexity, moved into a long holding pattern. A trial-setting hearing in December 2025 yielded no firm date. The parties agreed to revisit the matter in January 2026. The last allowable trial date was set as March 2nd, 2027. As of early 2026, Robert Eugene Chandler remains in the Lewis County Jail on a no-bail hold, awaiting a trial that will determine whether he is held legally accountable for the deaths of Donald Piccolo and Kimberly Torres. He has a documented history of criminal convictions going back to 2008, including assaults, domestic violence offenses, a burglary, and multiple violations of supervision conditions. He is a man whose life had long been marked by instability, addiction, and violence. But none of that history could have predicted or excused what allegedly happened on that February afternoon in Winlock. For the family of Donald Piccolo and those who loved Kimberly Torres, the waiting is its own kind of pain. Both victims lived quiet, ordinary lives in a small community. They opened their home to someone in need, extended the modest generosity of hot water and shelter to a man who came 3 times a week with nothing more than a need for a shower. In doing so, they became vulnerable in ways they could never have anticipated. Their deaths went undiscovered for 21 days, 3 weeks during which the world went on around them, unaware. That silence, stretching from February 4th to February 25th, is perhaps the most haunting dimension of the entire case. The sense that 2 people were simply gone and no one knew. The town of Winlock knew them, though. And when the truth finally came to light behind that forced open door, it did not simply grieve them as victims. It grieved them as people, as Donald, who came home from a medical appointment, and as Kimberly, who bought something on February 3rd and tucked the receipt into her purse, not knowing it would become evidence in a murder investigation. They were real. They were known. And the case that bears their names is, above all else, a reminder of how profoundly ordinary lives can be shattered, and how long the fight for justice can take in the aftermath of an act that took only a single, terrible day. Story 4. There are places in the world that seem designed to make you forget your troubles. Resorts where the turquoise water kisses the shore so gently that the sound alone is enough to quiet the noise in your head. Cancun, Mexico, is one of those places. Its white sand beaches and luxury hotels have long promised escape, renewal, and joy. In the spring of 2010, a family of 4 arrived at the Moon Palace Spa and Golf Resort with the hope of all those things. 2 children, a husband, and a mother who was turning 42 years old. Her name was Monica Burgos, and she would never see her birthday. Monica Burgos was born in Brazil with the kind of spirit that left an impression on everyone she met. People who knew her described her as vibrant, warm, and fiercely devoted to the 2 things she loved most in the world: her children and her family. She carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but makes itself known to anyone who spends more than 5 minutes in a room with her. She had built a life in Los Angeles, California, married to a man who had achieved significant success in the American television industry. His name was Bruce Beersford Redman, and in the world of reality television, he was something of a known commodity, a producer who had worked on the massively popular shows. He had even received 3 Emmy nominations for his work. On paper, theirs was the kind of life that looked polished and complete. But appearances, as they so often do, concealed something far more complicated. Bruce and Monica had married in 1999, and together they had 2 children, a boy named Alec and a girl named Camilla. For years, the couple navigated the pressures of a demanding industry, the rhythms of raising a young family, and the ordinary strains that test any marriage. But somewhere along the way, the foundation beneath them had quietly begun to crack. Bruce, during a period when he was not working and Monica was the one financially supporting the family, had developed a troubling habit that he had spent thousands of dollars, reportedly as much as $5,000, on telephone chat services. When Monica confronted him with proof, he had broken down in tears, gotten on his knees, and begged for forgiveness, claiming that he was simply bored at home. She had tried to move past it. Then came the affair. In the months leading up to the fateful trip to Mexico, Monica discovered that her husband had been romantically involved with a casting director named Joy Pierce. She had stumbled upon intimate email messages and had overheard phone calls that left no room for doubt. This discovery destroyed the last of Monica's trust in her husband. There was even an incident involving a watch. Bruce had purchased an expensive watch, and it had been returned to the store by another woman, a woman matching the description of Pierce. Monica had gone to the store herself and learned the truth from a clerk. Something inside her had hardened after that. She made a decision. She wanted a divorce. And then, in what feels, in hindsight, almost impossibly strange, the couple agreed to take a vacation together anyway. It was Cancun, just the 2 of them and the children, to celebrate Monica's upcoming 42nd birthday. Perhaps it was one last attempt at reconciliation. Perhaps the trip had been planned long before the unraveling, and canceling it felt too painful for the children. Or perhaps it was simply the fragile, irrational logic of a marriage dying in slow motion. 2 people bound together by shared children and a shared history, unable to quite let go even as they tore apart. Whatever the reason, in early April of 2010, the Beersford Redman family checked into the gleaming, luxurious Moon Palace Spa and Golf Resort. The first days of the vacation were not peaceful. Guests and staff at the resort began to notice that the couple was arguing. Not just the kind of quiet, contained friction that couples on the edge of a breakup might try to conceal, but loud, visible conflict. One witness reported seeing Bruce move aggressively toward Monica, stopping only when he realized there were people nearby watching. That witness's account would later carry tremendous weight. English tourists staying in the room directly next to the couples began hearing alarming sounds through the wall. A woman's screams, desperate cries for help, and loud, heavy banging sounds. Troubled by what they were hearing, they reported it to the hotel concierge. The concierge rang the couple's room. Bruce answered. He told them there was nothing to worry about, that it was just a minor marital argument and everything was fine. The noises stopped. No one checked further. According to Bruce's own account, on the day that Monica vanished, she had told him she was going to spend time alone, shopping around the resort and treating herself to a spa day. He said he thought nothing of it when she did not return as the sun went down over the Caribbean. He assumed she had simply gone out into town to experience the Cancun nightlife. He was not worried, he later told investigators. He tucked the children in and went to sleep. It was not until the following morning, when Monica still had not come back and the children were asking for their mother, that Bruce reported her missing to the hotel staff. For 3 days, Mexican police combed through the resort and the surrounding areas, searching for any sign of Monica Burgos. The investigation produced little comfort, and with each passing hour, the dread deepened. Monica's family, her sisters, her closest friends, began pressing for answers. Then came the detail that made those who knew her feel a deep chill. Monica's mobile phone had been found left behind in the hotel room. For a woman who was supposedly out shopping and visiting spas, it was an inexplicable thing to leave behind. Her friends and family were quick to tell investigators something else. The story Bruce had told simply did not sound like Monica. She did not enjoy long shopping trips. She did not like spending extended stretches of time away from her children. Leaving for an entire day without her phone, without telling anyone, without calling to check on Alec and Camilla. It was not something the Monica they knew would ever do. Then came April 8, 2010. It was the day that was supposed to be Monica's birthday. The day she was supposed to turn 42 years old. Instead, it became the day that Mexican authorities found her body. She was discovered not far from the Moon Palace Resort, her naked form lying in a sewer, a dark, reeking drainage cistern that no one should ever have to describe. She had been bludgeoned and strangled. Her autopsy, conducted by Mexican forensic professionals, determined that her official cause of death was a critical lack of oxygen caused by airway obstruction. The manner of death, given the condition of her body, the bruises across her skin, and the place she had been discarded, was determined beyond any reasonable doubt to be homicide. Someone had beaten Monica Burgos, and then pressed the life from her body, and dumped her where they thought she might never be found. Within hours of the recovery of her body, Bruce Beersford Redman was brought in for questioning. He was cooperative enough in the initial interview, and investigators released him, but his passport was seized, and he was firmly told not to leave Mexican territory. The investigation that followed began to pull back the curtain on the couple's marriage in ways that were damaging for Bruce. The affair with Joy Pierce was documented. The marital strife was corroborated by multiple witnesses. The screams heard through the hotel room walls the night before Monica was reported missing gained new and terrible significance. When investigators returned to examine the couple's resort room more carefully, they found something that would prove pivotal: traces of blood. Then came a revelation that would land like a thunderclap in the American press. It emerged that in the week before Monica's body was discovered, Bruce had taken out not one but 2 life insurance policies in her name. The timing was stunning. A man whose wife was asking for a divorce, who had financially depended on her while she supported the family, had ensured that her death would be worth a substantial sum of money. Despite all of this, Bruce Beersford Redman fled. In an act of breathtaking audacity, he crossed the border from Mexico into the United States using only his driver's license as identification, slipping past the border without anyone stopping him. He made his way back to Los Angeles. Mexican authorities and prosecutors were furious. American authorities were notified. What followed was a lengthy, messy, and deeply contentious extradition battle that would drag on for over 2 years, during which Bruce publicly maintained his absolute innocence, giving interviews in which he told the world he had not killed his wife, that he was a grieving father, that his children needed him. Back in Brazil and in Los Angeles, Monica's sisters grieved. They had lost not only their sibling but a daughter, a mother, a woman who had been trying to protect herself and her children from a marriage that had quietly turned dangerous. Her family was left to raise her voice in the years that followed, speaking to media, supporting prosecutors, and waiting for the justice they believed she deserved. In 2012, after the extradition battle was finally resolved, Bruce Beersford Redman was sent back to Mexico to stand trial. The legal proceedings that followed were conducted within the Mexican justice system, in courts far from the Hollywood corridors where Bruce had once been celebrated. The evidence was methodically laid out before the court. The testimony of the English tourists who had heard screaming, the concierge who had been told it was merely a fight, the blood found in the room, the phone that Monica had left behind, the witnesses who had seen Bruce nearly attack his wife, the life insurance policies, the affair, the desperate last-minute divorce request, and the undeniable fact that he had fled the country when he was explicitly told not to. On March 12, 2015, nearly 5 years after Monica's body was found on what should have been her birthday, a Mexican judge in Cancun delivered the verdict. Bruce Beersford Redman was found guilty of the aggravated murder of Monica Burgos. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay a fine. The statement released by the family's attorney, Alison Treacle, was both measured and deeply moving. The family of Monica Burgos has just been informed that Bruce Beersford Redman has been convicted in Mexico of Monica's murder. It has been nearly 5 years since they lost their beloved sister. Not a day goes by that they don't miss her terribly, and nothing will bring her back, but they can finally say that she has received the justice she deserved. There was no celebration in those words, only exhaustion, grief, and the quiet relief of an ending, even one that could never be called a happy one. Bruce served approximately 7.5 years in the Mexican correctional facility before his release in September 2019. He walked out of prison at the age of 48. Throughout his incarceration and even after his release, he continued to assert his innocence, never publicly acknowledging responsibility for what the court had determined he had done. Monica's children, Alec and Camilla, had grown up in the years their father was imprisoned. They had spent the critical, formative years of their childhood navigating the loss of their mother and the incarceration of their father. What the world took from them is immeasurable. They lost their mother in a sewer in Cancun. They lost their father to a prison cell in the country where she died, and they were left to build a life from the wreckage of choices they had no part in making. The case of Monica Burgos is not simply a story about a crime. It is a story about the violence that can live inside the most ordinary-looking of lives, about the way betrayal and desperation can curdle into something irreversible, and about the women who are hurt by the people they trusted most. Monica was 41 years old when she died. She had been trying in those final weeks to save herself, asking for a divorce, standing up for what she needed, refusing to quietly accept a marriage that had broken her heart. That courage was not rewarded in the way it deserved to be. She deserved to see her 42nd birthday. She deserved to watch her children grow up. She deserved better than the ending that came for her in that resort in Cancun, found in a drainage ditch on the day the world should have been celebrating her. Her name was Monica Burgos, and she is not forgotten. Story 5. There are crimes that shake a city down to its bones. Crimes that leave a scar so deep that even years later, decades later, the mention of a name is enough to bring the wound back to the surface. In Jacksonville, Florida, that name is Maddie Clifton. And the crime that carries it is not just a story about a stolen life, though it is very much that. It is a story about a neighborhood, a friendship, a family's worst nightmare, and a boy whose violence concealed itself beneath the perfectly ordinary face of a 14-year-old who played with dogs and helped search for the very girl he had killed. Madeline Ray Clifton was born on June 17, 1990, into a family that loved her fiercely. She was 8 years old in November 1998, with the kind of childhood that is measured in piano lessons and afternoon games, and the particular freedom of suburban streets in the early evening when the light goes golden and kids run between houses with no particular purpose except joy. She lived on a quiet residential street in Jacksonville, in a house directly across the road from a family named Phillips. She knew the Phillipses well. She had played in their yard. She had appeared on their home video, laughing and running with their dog, alongside her older sister Jessie. Her parents, Steve and Sheila Clifton, knew the family, trusted them, had no reason not to. Maddie liked their son. His name was Joshua Phillips, and he was 14 years old, 6 years older than Maddie, but a boy she considered a friend. Joshua Phillips, Josh to the neighborhood, was described by nearly everyone who knew him as quiet and friendly. His teachers at school recalled him as popular, fun, and unremarkable in the way that well-adjusted children are unremarkable. He did not stand out, did not cause trouble, did not give anyone reason for alarm. He had no history of arrests, no history of violence. On the surface, there was nothing about him that would cause a parent to hesitate before allowing a child to play near him. But beneath that surface, invisible to the neighborhood, was a home life that carried its own particular darkness. Joshua's father, Steve Phillips, was a man ruled by addiction and rage. By the accounts of both Joshua and his mother, Melissa, Steve was a violent alcoholic and drug user who imposed harsh and arbitrary rules on his household and was prone to explosive anger. One of Steve's rules was rigid and non-negotiable. Joshua was not allowed to have other children in the house when his parents were not home. Steve harbored a particular dislike for girls, for reasons that Melissa said she never fully understood. He had uprooted the family from Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, separating Joshua from his half-brothers and from the only home he had known, and resettled them in Jacksonville, Florida. The move left Joshua isolated in ways that went unspoken. Fear of his father was, according to Joshua's own later account, the lens through which he interpreted nearly everything. On the afternoon of November 3, 1998, the threads of two lives intersected in a way that would end one of them forever. Maddie came home from school at approximately 4:30 that afternoon. She practiced her piano, as she was supposed to, and then went outside to play, the most ordinary sequence of events imaginable. At some point, she crossed the street and knocked on Joshua's door. She asked him to come out and play baseball. Joshua hesitated, knowing his parents were not home and knowing his father's rules about visitors. He agreed anyway. The two went into the backyard and began throwing and hitting a baseball back and forth in the way children do, easy and unguarded, with no sense that the afternoon was anything other than what it appeared to be. Then, in a single careless moment, the ball hit Maddie in the eye. It was an accident. An 8-year-old takes a baseball to the eye and bleeds and cries out, and under any ordinary set of circumstances, the afternoon pauses, a parent is called, ice is applied, and the world resumes. But Joshua Phillips's circumstances were not ordinary. His father would be home soon. His father's rules had been broken the moment Maddie set foot in the yard. Joshua's mind, shaped by years of living in fear of Steve's unpredictable violence, clamped shut around the single overwhelming thought that he was going to be in terrible, painful trouble. Maddie was screaming. Maddie's screams were the sound of his punishment approaching. What happened next revealed something catastrophic about the state of that frightened 14-year-old's mind. Joshua dragged Maddie inside the house. He took her to his room. He struck her with the baseball bat to stop her from screaming. Then he shoved her into the space beneath his bed, the kind of waterbed frame with a hollow base, and went downstairs. When Steve arrived home, Joshua went through the motions of a normal evening. Father and son spoke. The house held its ordinary shape. No one who looked at Joshua in those moments could have seen what was beneath his bed in the room above them. At some point during that same evening, Joshua returned upstairs. He heard a sound that meant the unthinkable was still true. Maddie was alive. She was groaning beneath the mattress. Maddie had been found with her hand clutching the bed frame, a gesture of someone still fighting to hold on. Tells the story of what she endured beneath that mattress. It is a detail that resists easy contemplation. She had survived a blow to the head with a bat. She was lying in darkness, unable to call out, still alive. Joshua removed the mattress. He used the blade from a Leatherman tool. A pocket knife folded into a multi-purpose device, he stabbed her in the chest and abdomen. Joshua then replaced the mattress over her body. He went downstairs. He sealed what he had done inside his room and inside himself. Maddie Clifton's disappearance was reported to police at around 5 o'clock that same afternoon, before anyone imagined anything worse than a lost child. The search that followed was one of the largest and most heartfelt that Jacksonville had ever seen. Hundreds of volunteers combed the neighborhood and surrounding areas. Police officers conducted grid searches. Flyers bearing Maddie's face were distributed across the city. Sheila and Steve Clifton appeared publicly, their grief raw and visible, pleading for any information that might bring their daughter home. The community, genuinely shaken, responded with the full force of collective goodwill. Among the volunteers who searched for Maddie Clifton in the days that followed was Joshua Phillips himself. He walked alongside neighbors. He participated in the search. He looked for her with them, carrying in his room the answer to every question they were asking. For 6 days the city searched. Then, on the morning of November 10th, 1998, it ended, though not the way anyone had prayed it would. Melissa Phillips went into her son's room to clean it. She noticed a smell that air fresheners had been deployed to conceal, but which had grown too powerful to be masked. She noticed a wet spot on the floor near the base of the bed. Melissa lifted the mattress. What she found there The body of the 8-year-old girl who had lived across the street, the child she knew, the child everyone had been searching for, caused her to leave the house immediately and go directly to the police. Sheriff Nat Glover of Jacksonville was among the officials who had to receive that news and act on it. He struggled to contain his own emotion, but the case had shifted in an instant from a missing child investigation to a murder case, and his department moved accordingly. Joshua Phillips was arrested that same day at his school. Within hours of his arrest, he confessed. He told investigators what had happened in that backyard and what had happened in that room, and his account, including the detail about the baseball hitting Maddie's eye by accident and his panic about his father, formed the narrative that would define the case. It also opened a painful and enduring debate about how much of what he said was true and how much had been shaped after the fact. State Attorney Harry Shorstein, who led the prosecution, did not accept Joshua's account at face value. Prosecutors noted that no blood was found in the backyard where Joshua said the baseball had struck Maddie. No blood was found on the baseball itself. These were not trivial inconsistencies. They were structural cracks in the only version of events available, raising the possibility that what happened to Maddie had not begun with an accident, but with something premeditated. Shorstein also noted that Joshua had been known to discuss physical matters with both Maddie and her older sister Jessie, and he suggested the murder may have had a physical motivation. The autopsy found no evidence of physical assault, but the prosecution argued that the absence of dirt and sand on Maddie's body did not support Joshua's claim that her clothes had come off as he dragged her across the yard. These details went unresolved. The true origin of what happened in that backyard on November 3rd, 1998 has never been established beyond Joshua's own account. Joshua Phillips was 14 years old. Under Florida law and the decision of prosecutors, he was tried as an adult. The trial was moved from Duval County to Polk County because of the overwhelming publicity surrounding the case in Jacksonville. His defense attorney, Richard D. Nichols, made a decision that would later be questioned. He called no witnesses for the defense. Not one. He intended to base the entire case on his closing argument to the jury, in which he framed Maddie's death as something that began as an accident and descended through panic. Joshua never testified. He sat through a trial that lasted only 2 days and said nothing. On July 8, 1999, jurors took just over 2 hours to return a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Joshua Phillips was 15 years old when he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the years that followed, the weight of the sentence never entirely settled into certainty. 2 of the officials most responsible for placing Joshua in prison for life, State Attorney Harry Shorstein and Sheriff Nat Glover, later admitted to having doubts about whether a mandatory life sentence without parole was the right outcome for a 14-year-old. Shorstein said in 2008 that he regretted not offering Joshua a plea to second-degree murder, which would have allowed the judge more flexibility in sentencing. Glover, who had once advocated strongly for the harshest possible sentence, reflected that he had never believed the murder to be malicious or calculated in the way a premeditated killing typically is. Given a different set of circumstances, Glover said, it would never have happened. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark, which declared that sentencing juveniles to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole was unconstitutional. That ruling opened the door for Joshua Phillips to seek resentencing. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and emotionally devastating for Maddie's family. In June 2017, a resentencing hearing was held. Clifton's mother, Sheila, appeared in court to ask that the sentence be upheld. Josh did get a life sentence, she said with a composure that barely contained the depths of her grief. But Maddie got the death sentence. She was only 8 years old. In November 2017, Circuit Judge Waddell Wallace resentenced Joshua Phillips to life in prison. A life sentence, but one that would become eligible for further review in 2023 based on demonstrated maturity and rehabilitation, rather than mandatory and permanent. In prison, the boy who had once played baseball in a Jacksonville backyard had grown into a man who completed his GED, took college courses by correspondence, worked as a paralegal assisting other inmates with their legal appeals, tutored fellow prisoners, played guitar in a band, and participated in religious services. By 2017, prosecutors acknowledged that he had been a model inmate. In 2025, his case returned to court once more as Joshua Phillips, now in his early 40s, sought a sentencing review. The Clifton family again made clear that they did not believe he should ever be released. Maddie Clifton never had the chance to grow into the person she would have become. She was 8 years old, a piano-practicing, dog-loving, street-crossing little girl who knocked on a neighbor's door one November afternoon because she wanted to play baseball. Her death was not the consequence of strangers colliding in the dark. It happened in the space of one ordinary afternoon, between people who knew each other, in a neighborhood where nothing seemed to threaten anything. It happened because a boy who was afraid of his father made a choice, and then another choice, and then another, each one closing off the possibility of the last exit, until there was no way out that he could see except through an 8-year-old girl who deserved none of it. In Jacksonville, her name is still spoken with a particular weight. The case it belongs to has passed through courtrooms and appeals, through documentaries and podcasts, through decades of legal arguments about juvenile sentencing and the limits of punishment. But at the center of all of it, beneath every constitutional question and every legal precedent, there is still always the image of a small girl clutching a bed frame in the dark, holding on with everything she had, in a room across the street from her own home. Story 6. In the town of Milford, Connecticut, autumn arrives with a gentleness that seems almost deliberate. The trees turn slowly, the light softens, and the streets of the modest residential neighborhoods settle into the kind of quiet that makes you believe, for a moment, that nothing bad could find its way here. It is the kind of place where people stay for generations, where families plant roots in modest homes and watch their children grow up in the same rooms where they themselves once slept. It is a place with expectations of ordinary life, the kind of life that proceeds without drama, without violence, without the kind of loss that hollows out a family and leaves behind a shape in the air where a person used to be. Alexandra Dukay grew up in Milford. She was everything that word bright is supposed to convey, not just in the way she looked, though she was strikingly beautiful, but in the way she moved through the world. She graduated from Jonathan Law High School with the bearing of someone who understood that her life was going somewhere. She went on to Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, where she earned her degree with honors, magna cum laude, a distinction reserved for those who do not simply pass through their education, but engage with it completely. After graduation, she built a professional life of quiet, steady ambition. She worked as a systems analyst at People's Bank, a demanding and skilled role that she had held for nearly a decade. She earned her real estate license. And then, alongside all of that, she pursued the thing she loved most with the particular discipline of someone who refused to let a dream stay only a dream. She danced, she modeled, she acted. She had appeared on an episode of long-running television drama that millions of Americans had welcomed into their living rooms for decades. It was a small role, but it was real. It was proof. Her family called her Xandra, and in that nickname lived the warmth of a household that adored her. Matthew Pugh entered Alexandra's life when she was 16 years old, young enough to be reshaped by the experience, young enough for the relationship to leave marks she might carry for years without fully recognizing them as marks. He was older, and there was something about him that must have seemed compelling at that age, the way certain people carry a gravity that pulls others toward them before the danger is visible. They dated for a considerable period of time, and during those years, Matthew Pugh accumulated a criminal record that eventually sent him to prison on drug-related charges. It was during his incarceration that Alexandra, now a grown woman with a career and an identity entirely her own, ended the relationship. The breakup was not discussed over coffee, not negotiated with the quiet sadness of two people who simply wanted different things. It happened at a distance across prison walls, and Matthew Pugh did not accept it. From behind bars, he wrote letters to Alexandra. They were not the letters of a man processing grief or asking for understanding. They were the letters of someone consumed by something darker, something that had curdled over time into threat and menace. In one letter, he told her that she needed to get hurt. He told her she was going to regret ever meeting him. He promised, with the cold precision of a man who believed his own words, that he would make her life a living hell. Alexandra's mother, Linda Dukay, read those letters, and did what any mother who loved her daughter would do. She wrote to the Connecticut Department of Corrections. She alerted them. She placed her fear on the official record in the hope that some authority would recognize it for what it was. Alexandra herself filed a formal written complaint on January 23, 2004. She described the threats. She named the author. She tried, in the language of bureaucracy and procedure, to build a wall between herself and what was coming. Matthew Pugh was released from prison in 2004. 2 years remained between that moment and the morning that would change everything. Those 2 years were not peaceful. His release did not mean the end of the harassment. It meant the beginning of a new and more menacing phase of it. He began to stalk Alexandra. He appeared in the spaces of her life uninvited, a presence that carried with it the memory of every threat he had written and every promise of harm he had made. The psychological weight of living under that kind of surveillance, knowing that someone who had threatened your life was now free and watching, is something that ordinary language struggles to fully capture. Alexandra managed to go to work each day, to maintain her professional life, to continue pursuing her acting, to smile in photographs and appear in television credits and be Xandra to her family. But the fear was there, sitting beneath everything. A month before her death, she sat with her brother Matthew and told him plainly that she was afraid of what Matthew Pugh might do to her. She said it out loud. She gave the fear a shape and showed it to someone she trusted. A year before her murder, in 2005, Matthew Pugh sat down with his cousin Anthony and described, in precise and chilling terms, exactly what he intended to do to Alexandra Dukay. He was not speaking in anger, in the overheated language of a man venting frustration. He had a plan. He told Anthony that he was going to inject Alexandra with drugs. He would cause an overdose and make it look like she had taken her own life. To conceal the evidence, he would use materials stolen from the hardware supply outlet where he and Anthony both worked, including a specific type of black vinyl tape that was stocked by only a handful of stores in the entire region. He described the plan with a methodical clarity that had disturbed him profoundly. Anthony Pugh heard all of this, and he carried it with him. And for reasons that are deeply human and deeply complicated, fear, uncertainty, the terrible weight of turning in someone you know, he did not immediately go to the police. On the morning of May 19, 2006, Alexandra Dukay was at home in the family residence on Milford's quiet streets. The day was an ordinary Friday, the kind of day that does not announce itself as final. At 11:47 in the morning, a cell phone signal pinged off the tower that served the part of Milford where the Dukay home was located. At 12:07 that same afternoon, another ping registered from the same location. Both calls traced back to Matthew Pugh's phone. He was there. He was in her neighborhood during the window of time that investigators would later determine was when Alexandra was killed. Linda Dukay was the one who found her daughter. To lose a child is among the most devastating experiences a human being can endure. To find that child, to walk into your own home and discover what has been done to her, is a particular cruelty that cannot be softened by any amount of clinical language. What Linda encountered in the basement of the family's Milford home on May 19, 2006 was what one detective, who arrived at the scene shortly thereafter, described as probably the worst thing he had ever seen in his career. Alexandra had been beaten so savagely that she was nearly unrecognizable. Blood had sprayed across the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and onto the radiator against the wall. The room bore the signature of an attack that had not been quick or accidental. It bore the signature of sustained, deliberate, repeated violence. On the floor near Alexandra's body, investigators found the blade of a kitchen knife. But as they examined the room more carefully, something else caught their attention. Alexandra had kept a collection of her childhood trophies, the kind of small, meaningful objects that accumulate over a life, each one representing a moment of achievement, a competition won, a milestone reached. One of those trophies was missing. Given the nature of her injuries, and given the blood patterns in the room, investigators concluded that the trophy was almost certainly the primary weapon, that the blunt force trauma that the medical examiner would formally list as the cause of Alexandra's death had been inflicted with something she had earned as a young girl, something that had sat on a shelf in the home where she had grown up. The thought is almost unbearable. There was one more detail in the chaos of that scene. Stuck to Alexandra's cheek was a small piece of black vinyl tape. Alexandra Dukay was 26 years old. The investigation that followed was thorough and determined. Milford Police and Connecticut State Police began working the case, gathering evidence, developing leads, and building a picture of who had entered that home and why. The name Matthew Pugh was not unknown to investigators. The history of threats, the restraining orders, the written complaints were all part of a record that pointed clearly in his direction. But evidence that is sufficient to convince a detective is not the same as evidence that is sufficient to convict a person in a court of law. The DNA analysis, the cell phone records, the forensic examination of the scene, all of it needed time. In the absence of a witness who had actually seen what happened, the case required the kind of painstaking, layered construction that takes months and years, not days. What investigators found during those years was compelling, but not yet complete. DNA evidence was developed that placed Matthew Pugh at the Dukay residence on the day of the murder. The cell phone records told the story of his physical proximity at the precise time Alexandra was killed. And then there was the tape, that small piece of black vinyl tape on Alexandra's cheek. Investigators traced its origin with the care that true forensic work requires. It was a specific, uncommon type of tape, carried by only 3 outlet stores in the region. One of those stores was the hardware supply outlet where Matthew Pugh had worked. Investigators later found a roll of that same tape inside his house. But even with all of that, the case stalled. Matthew Pugh was not charged. The file remained open. The Dukay family, who had never stopped believing that justice was possible, remained in continuous contact with police. They never lost faith, Alexandra's brother Matthew told reporters years later. But faith requires endurance, and 6 years is a very long time to endure. The state of Connecticut eventually offered a governor's award of $50,000 for any information leading to the conviction of the person responsible for Alexandra's murder, an acknowledgement that the case needed something more, something human, to unlock what the evidence alone could not yet prove. That something came on June 19, 2008, 2 years after the murder. Anthony Pugh, Matthew's cousin, the man who had sat across from Matthew in 2005 and listened to the plan, the drugs, the tape, the hardware store, all of it, walked into the Milford Police Department. He told investigators everything. He told them what Matthew had said in 2005. He told them about the plan, the injection of drugs, the intended overdose, the tape. Every detail that Anthony had carried for 3 years now passed into the official record of the investigation, and the shape of the case changed irrevocably. Investigators compared what Anthony told them against the physical evidence. The tape matched. The plan matched. The DNA matched. The cell phone records matched. The picture that emerged was not of an impulsive act committed in a moment of passion, but of a murder that had been premeditated, rehearsed in conversation, and ultimately executed, though not in the way Matthew had originally described to his cousin. The drugs were never used. The plan changed. What remained constant was the intent, and what happened in that Milford basement reflected that intent fully. On September 5, 2012, more than 6 years after Alexandra's death, Matthew Pugh was arrested and arraigned at Milford Superior Court. He was 40 years old. Outside the courthouse, Alexandra's brother stood in the September air and spoke to reporters about what those 6 years had felt like for his family. He described it as a long and painful process. He said they had never lost faith. He was 34 years old, and he had spent more than 6 years carrying the knowledge of what had been done to his sister. Jury selection for the trial of Matthew Pugh began in January 2015, nearly 9 years after Alexandra Dukay was killed. The trial itself opened in February of that year and concluded with a verdict delivered by a jury of 9 women and 3 men. On March 1, 2015, Matthew Pugh was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was convicted for the killing of a 26-year-old woman who had wanted to dance and act and build a life in the city that never stops moving, who had filed formal complaints and told her brother she was afraid, and who had nonetheless been found in the basement of her own home by her own mother. The jury heard the DNA evidence, the cell phone records, the tape evidence, the cousin's account of the 2005 conversation, and they reached the only conclusion the facts supported. 2 years later, in 2017, Judge Denise Markle presided over the sentencing. She imposed a sentence of 60 years for the murder of Alexandra Dukay and an additional 20 years for burglary, to be served concurrently. The judge did not frame this as a punishment that left any room for optimism about rehabilitation. The brutality of the crime, she said, was a significant factor in the severity of the sentence. Rehabilitation was, in her assessment, out of the question. Matthew Pugh received the maximum sentence available under the law. For the Dukay family, justice arrived, but it arrived at a cost that no sentence could offset. Linda Dukay had found her daughter in that basement. She had written letters to the Department of Corrections years before the murder, had tried to name the danger before it arrived. Alexandra herself had filed official complaints, had spoken her fear aloud to her brother, had done the things that people who understand danger are supposed to do when they recognize it. The system received all of those signals and could not prevent what followed. That is one of the cruelest truths embedded in this case. Not just that a young woman was murdered, but that she had tried to stop it. She had looked at the future approaching her and called it by its right name, and the structures around her had not been sufficient to redirect it. She graduated with honors. She held down a demanding career and a real estate license, and a dream that she worked on in the hours left over from everything else. She was Xandra to her family. She was 26 years old when her mother found her in the basement, and she was surrounded by her own childhood trophies, the evidence of everything she had already accomplished in a life that had barely begun. The case that bears her name is, finally, a case that arrived at a verdict. But it is also a reminder that verdicts come too late for the people they are meant for, and that the woman at the center of this story was not simply a victim in a case file. She was someone who laughed in photographs and appeared on television and told her brother the truth about how afraid she was, and who deserved every ordinary day she never got to live. Story 7. There is a stretch of highway in Florida where the palmetto scrub grows thick on either side of the road, and the sky turns the color of bruised fruit at dusk. It is the kind of road where headlights appear and disappear in the distance like fireflies, where truckers and travelers pass through without much thought about what might be waiting in the dark just off the shoulder. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, this was the landscape where a series of bodies began to appear, men, middle-aged, shot multiple times and left with quiet brutality in the brush. The case that grew from those roadside discoveries would become one of the most haunting, debated, and deeply human tragedies in American criminal history. At the center of it was a woman who had been failed by the world long before she ever turned her failure back upon it. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. She was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, a leap year child, as if even the calendar could not quite decide where she belonged. The circumstances of her birth were already shadowed by dysfunction. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted as molester who would eventually die by suicide inside a prison cell. He had never met his daughter. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was a teenager who found herself unable to cope and walked away from her children when Aileen was just 4 years old, leaving behind Aileen and her older brother, Keith. The two children were taken in by their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, and legally adopted by them in 1960. Aileen grew up believing, for a time, that her grandparents were her biological parents, a fiction that crumbled when the truth eventually found its way to her, as truth always does. The household she grew up in offered little refuge. Her grandfather was a violent man who beat the children. Her grandmother, Britta, reportedly struggled with alcoholism. There was no softness in the home, no corner where a child could feel safe and wanted. What Aileen grew up knowing, from the very beginning, was that the world was a cold and indifferent place that would take from you freely and give back almost nothing. By the age of 11, she had already begun to trade sexual favors with neighborhood boys in exchange for small things: beer, cigarettes, money. At 14, she became pregnant. The father was an older man, a friend of her grandfather's. The child, a boy, was born in 1971 and given up for adoption almost immediately. That same year, when Aileen was still just 14 years old, her grandmother died. Shortly afterward, her grandfather made the final, shattering decision. He threw her out of the house. She was a teenager, alone, with no parents, no home, and no one who would claim her as their own. What happened next is the kind of story that makes the stomach turn, not because of what Aileen did, but because of what was done to her. She began living in the woods near her old neighborhood, surviving by selling herself on the roadside to men who drove past. She hitchhiked across the country, slept wherever she could find shelter, and survived by whatever means available. She accumulated arrests for driving under the influence, for disorderly conduct, for armed robbery. She tried marriage once, in 1976, to a wealthy 69-year-old man named Louis Gratz-Fell, who had seen her profile in a boating magazine. The marriage collapsed within weeks when Aileen was arrested for assaulting a bar patron. The man she had married, who had shown her the first material comfort she had ever known, filed a restraining order against her. There were years of drifting after that. Aileen attempted suicide multiple times during this period, unable to find her footing in a world that seemed to have no place for her. She was arrested in 1982 in Edgewater, Florida, for armed robbery. She was convicted and served time. By the mid-1980s, she was back on the streets of Florida, moving between Daytona Beach and the surrounding areas, working as a hitchhiking prostitute along the highways, surviving day by day. She had been through more in 3 decades of life than most people encounter in a lifetime of hardship. Then, in 1986, she walked into a bar in Daytona Beach and met someone, a 24-year-old woman named Tyria Moore. Tyria was younger, quieter, more grounded in daily life. She worked ordinary jobs. She was, by all accounts, the most stable thing Aileen had encountered in years. The two women fell deeply in love and began a relationship that would last for years, moving between cheap motels and rented rooms, cobbling together an existence from Aileen's earnings from prostitution and whatever Tyria could bring in from her various jobs. They lived in a condition that was never comfortable and often desperate, but they had each other, and for Aileen, that counted for something enormous. The love between them was real. The desperation was real. And the violence, when it came, was already coiled somewhere deep inside a woman who had spent her entire life absorbing the worst of what human beings can do to one another. On November 30th, 1989, a man named Richard Charles Mallory drove his car along a stretch of road in Volusia County, Florida. He was 51 years old, the owner of an electronics repair store in Clearwater, and he had picked up a hitchhiker. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. What happened in that car, on that dark roadside, Mallory had driven her to a secluded location under the pretense of a consensual encounter and had then turned violent. He beat her, bound her with a cord, and assaulted her with terrible cruelty, telling her she was going to die. Then she reached into her purse, found the .22 caliber pistol she carried for protection, and shot him. She fired because she believed, with the cold clarity of absolute terror, that if she did not, she would not survive the night. Mallory's body was found 2 days later, wrapped in a piece of carpet and left in the brush near the road. He had been shot multiple times. His car had been found abandoned before his body was discovered. Police began investigating, but they had no immediate leads. Then the bodies kept appearing. In May and June of 1990, 2 more men were found along Florida highways: David Spears, a construction worker, and Charles Carskadden, a 40-year-old part-time rodeo worker. Carskadden was found nude and decomposing in Pasco County, shot 8 times with a .22 caliber weapon. Aileen would later claim, in archival footage reviewed by investigators, that she killed him after believing he was involved in dangerous activities. For each victim, the pattern was eerily similar: middle-aged men found shot, discovered off roads, their belongings missing. In June of 1990, a missionary named Peter seems vanished after leaving his home in Jupiter, Florida, for a trip to visit family in Arkansas. His car was eventually found, but his body never was. The killings continued into the summer and early fall. Troy Burress, a 50-year-old sausage delivery man, was found shot in Marion County in August. Dick Humphreys, a 56-year-old retired chief of police, was found in September in Marion County, shot 6 times. Walter Gino Antonio, 60, a trucker, was found near Brevard County in November 1990, shot 4 times. 7 men in just over a year, all found along the highways of Florida, all sharing the same general profile: middle-aged, traveling alone, the sort of men who might pick up a woman hitchhiking on a quiet road. For investigators across multiple Florida counties, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was targeting men along these highways with a calculated and repeating method. The question was who, and the evidence, when it finally began to surface, told a startling story. The break in the case came through the oldest of investigative tools: patient, methodical detective work, and a single fingerprint. While looking into the disappearance and murder of Richard Mallory, Volusia County investigators discovered that items belonging to him had turned up in a local pawn shop. The receipt from that transaction bore a thumbprint. That thumbprint, when run through the Florida criminal database, came back as a match to a woman with a substantial criminal history in the state. Her name, or at least one of the many names she had used over the years, was Aileen Wuornos. The investigation expanded. More stolen items belonging to other victims were traced to pawn shops that Aileen had visited, sometimes using different aliases but always leaving behind her fingerprints. A camera belonging to Mallory was found in a rented storage unit, opened with a key taken from Aileen. Items from other victims were identified and traced back to her. Slowly, meticulously, investigators assembled the evidence into an undeniable chain. On July 4, 1990, months before her arrest, Aileen and Tyria had crashed the car belonging to victim Peter Seams on a Florida road. A witness named Rhonda Bailey had seen two women climb out of the damaged car and walk away, and she provided police with detailed descriptions of them both. Those descriptions were eventually circulated to the media as part of a campaign to locate the two women. The composite drawings were published in newspapers across Florida. People began calling in tips. By late December 1990, investigators had identified Aileen Wuornos and were closing in. They located her at a biker bar in Port Orange called The Last Resort. She was arrested on January 9, 1991, on an outstanding warrant unrelated to the murders. Tyria Moore, confronted separately by investigators, agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. She placed a series of phone calls to Aileen while law enforcement listened to every word. In those calls, Tyria pleaded with Aileen. She told her she was worried about her own safety. She told her she needed to know what had happened. The conversations were careful, coded, and deeply emotional. Aileen, who loved Tyria more than she had ever loved anything in the world, could not bear to let her suffer or be at risk. 3 days later, on January 16, 1991, Aileen Wuornos confessed. She sat across from investigators and told them everything. She described each killing in detail. She said, with a consistency she maintained for years, that every one of those men had tried to rape or assault her, and that she had acted in self-defense. She said she had been a woman alone on the highways of Florida for decades, working in conditions that made violence a constant threat, and that the men she had killed had brought their fate upon themselves by trying to harm her first. She was not remorseful in the way investigators expected. She was defiant, raw, and at times oddly peaceful, as though having someone finally listen to her account of things, even in this context, was something she had been waiting years for. The trial of Aileen Wuornos began in January 1992, and from the start, the deck was impossibly stacked. Her defense attorneys attempted to introduce evidence that Richard Mallory, the first victim, had a prior criminal conviction for assault with intent to rape. This fact, had the jury known it, might have lent significant credibility to Aileen's claim that she had killed him in genuine self-defense against a man with a documented history of violence toward women. But the judge ruled the evidence inadmissible. The jury never heard it. What the jury did hear was the phone confession, in which Aileen had told Tyria she had killed the men. They heard Tyria Moore testify against the woman she had shared her life with for years. They heard the prosecution describe Aileen as a predator, a woman who had selected her victims for financial gain, robbing them after shooting them, using the claim of self-defense as a convenient shield behind which to hide cold-blooded murder. Aileen's defense painted a different picture, a woman who had been subjected to violence her entire life, who had been failed by every institution that should have protected her, who had spent decades navigating predatory men with nothing but a small pistol and a desperate will to survive. They pointed to her childhood, to the abuse, to the abandonment, to the years of exposure to exactly the kind of violence she claimed these men had visited upon her. They argued that she had killed out of fear, not calculation. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On January 27, 1992, Aileen Wuornos was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Richard Mallory. When the verdict was read, she rose from her chair and screamed at the jury, not just anger, but something that sounded like grief and betrayal made audible. She was sentenced to death by electrocution on January 31st, 1992. In the months that followed, she pleaded no contest or guilty to the murders of David Spears, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, Charles Carskadden, and Walter Antonio. Each plea brought another death sentence. She was never tried for the murder of Peter Seams, because his body was never recovered. She had 6 death sentences in total. The years Aileen spent on death row were as turbulent as the years that had come before. In November 1991, while the legal proceedings were still ongoing, a 44-year-old woman named Arlene Prawl, a born-again Christian who had seen Eileen's photograph in a newspaper, contacted her out of nowhere. The two women corresponded, and Prawl eventually petitioned to become Eileen's legal adoptive mother. The adoption was finalized in November 1991. It was, by almost any measure, one of the stranger footnotes in an already strange story. A woman with no prior connection to Aileen Wuornos legally becoming her mother, just as Aileen faced multiple death sentences. Eileen's mental state became a subject of deep concern and significant controversy during her years in prison. In 2001, she made a decision that startled legal observers. She dropped all of her remaining appeals and announced that she wished to be executed. She told authorities and interviewers that she was tired, that she no longer wanted to live in a cage, and that the world beyond the prison walls had nothing left to offer her. Aileen, in her final years, appeared to be hearing things that were not there. She spoke of sound waves being bounced off the walls of her cell. She described sensations and experiences that suggested her mental health had deteriorated severely during her long years of isolation. Whether those revelations should have delayed or reconsidered her execution became a question that critics of the death penalty would raise long after she was gone. The question of her mental competency, the question of whether she had genuinely been a victim acting in self-defense, at least in that first killing, the question of whether a life like hers, born into abuse, raised in violence, discarded by family and institutions alike, could ever produce a truly free and responsible moral agent. These were the questions that sat like stones in the chest of anyone who looked closely at the full arc of her story. On the morning of October 9, 2002, Aileen Carol Wuornos was taken from her cell at Florida State Prison near Stark, Florida. She had refused her last meal. She was 46 years old. She was led to the execution chamber and administered a lethal injection at 9:47 in the morning. Her final statement, delivered with a strange and unnerving composure, was characteristically defiant and disorienting, a declaration that she would return, that she would be back like a scene from an action movie, sailing with Rock and with Jesus. The words made little rational sense. What they communicated, for those who had followed her story, was the portrait of a mind that had never been entirely intact, a woman speaking from somewhere that the rest of the world could not reach. She was the 10th woman to be executed in the United States since 1976. She was the second woman ever executed in the state of Florida. The victims she left behind, Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, and the never-found Peter Seams, were real men with real families, people who had gone out one day and never come home. Their deaths were real tragedies, and their loved ones carried grief that no verdict or execution could dissolve. Nothing about acknowledging the complicated humanity of Aileen Wuornos requires denying the humanity of the men who died, or the pain of the people who loved them. The case of Aileen Wuornos resists easy categorization. She is not simply a monster, though the things she did were monstrous. She is not simply a victim, though the evidence of what was done to her is extensive and heartbreaking. She is perhaps the clearest possible illustration of what can happen when a child is given no foundation, no protection, no love, and no resources. When a human being is fed, from the very beginning, a steady diet of violence and abandonment, and then released onto the world with all of that unprocessed inside them. She killed 7 men. She spent 12 years on death row. She died by lethal injection on a Wednesday morning in October, with no family beside her, in a prison in northern Florida. She had been failed long before she ever failed anyone else. That is not an excuse. It is simply the truth, and the truth of it is what makes the case of Aileen Wuornos so difficult to set down, so hard to close the page on, so persistent in the mind long after the final fact has been read. She was born unwanted, on a day that only comes once every 4 years, and she died alone. Between those two moments stretched a life of extraordinary suffering and extraordinary violence, a life that the world largely looked away from until it was too late to look away from anymore. Story 8. The cold November wind swept across Lincoln, Nebraska, carrying with it the first hints of the approaching winter. 24-year-old Sydney Loof was excited as she finished her shift at Menards, a sprawling hardware store where she worked as a cashier. It was November 15th, 2017, and Sydney had plans that evening that filled her with nervous anticipation. Like millions of other young people navigating the complexities of modern dating, she had connected with someone on Tinder, a popular dating app that promised connection in an increasingly digital world. This would be her second date with a woman named Bailey Boswell, and Sydney had told friends and family about her plans, sharing the small details of her life as she always did. Sydney was the kind of person who lit up a room without trying. Her family and friends knew her as someone with a gentle spirit, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. Working at Menards had given her a sense of independence and purpose, and she took pride in showing up reliably for every shift. When she left work that November evening, she had no way of knowing that she would never return, that her co-workers would soon be calling her phone with growing concern, wondering why she hadn't shown up for her next scheduled shift. The date she was heading toward would become the last journey of her young life, a meeting orchestrated not by chance or romance, but by calculated malice. Bailey Boswell, 23 years old at the time, had grown up in southern Iowa before making her way to Nebraska. She lived in a basement apartment in the small town of Wilbur, about 40 miles southwest of Lincoln, and she shared that space and her life with a man named Aubrey Trail. Trail was 51 years old, nearly 3 decades Boswell's senior, and he had built a life around manipulation and control. Together, they had created an unusual arrangement that involved fraud, group encounters, and a twisted philosophy that valued their desires above all else. Trail had a criminal history and a disturbing pattern of coercing women into his unconventional lifestyle, and in Boswell, he had found someone willing to follow his lead into increasingly dark territory. The relationship between Trail and Boswell was complex and troubling. They had already been involved in criminal enterprises together, defrauding an elderly Kansas couple out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in gold coins and collectibles through elaborate schemes. But as November 2017 approached, their activities were about to cross into territory far more sinister. Trail and Boswell had begun planning to kill someone. That murder itself had become part of Trail's twisted fantasies, and that Boswell had become an active participant in bringing those fantasies to life. They needed someone vulnerable, someone who could be lured and isolated, and they turned to the world of online dating to find their victim. Sydney's first date with Bailey Boswell had occurred on November 14th, just one day before her disappearance. The two women had connected on Tinder, exchanging messages that seemed innocent enough on the surface. Boswell presented herself as friendly and interested, and Sydney, who was open to meeting new people, agreed to spend time with her. That first date apparently went well enough that Sydney agreed to a second meeting the following evening. She had no reason to suspect that Bailey Boswell was anything other than what she appeared to be. No way to know that Bailey's boyfriend, Aubrey Trail, was orchestrating events from the shadows. What Sydney didn't know was that even as she was finishing her shift at Menards on November 15th, Trail and Boswell were already deep into their preparations. Security cameras at a Home Depot store in Lincoln captured footage that would later become crucial evidence in the case. The video showed Trail and Boswell walking through the aisles, selecting items with chilling purpose: hacksaws, trash bags, bleach, and various tools. They made these purchases while Sydney was still alive, still working her shift, still looking forward to the evening ahead. The premeditation was undeniable, captured in stark detail by surveillance footage that showed two people buying the instruments of murder hours before the act itself. When Sydney left to meet Bailey that evening, she sent messages to friends and family, small check-ins that marked the ordinary moments of her life. But after she arrived at the basement apartment in Wilbur, those messages stopped. The world outside continued spinning, unaware that something terrible was unfolding in that small town, in that basement apartment where the smell of bleach would soon permeate every surface. Sydney's phone went silent, her social media accounts inactive, and when she failed to show up for her next shift at Menards on November 16th, her co-workers knew immediately that something was wrong. Sydney was reliable, conscientious, not the type to simply disappear without explanation. Sydney's mother reported her missing on November 16th, her voice likely trembling as she explained to authorities that her daughter had gone on a date and never came home. The Lincoln Police Department launched an investigation immediately, and cell phone records quickly led them to Bailey Boswell's name and address in Wilbur. When investigators approached the basement apartment, the landlord who lived upstairs mentioned something disturbing. A powerful smell of bleach had been coming from the lower level, strong enough to be noticed throughout the building. When police entered the apartment, they found evidence that someone had frantically attempted to clean the space. Portions of the walls had been wiped down, surfaces scrubbed, all in what appeared to be a desperate effort to erase evidence of violence. In the days following Sydney's disappearance, Trail and Boswell attempted to control the narrative. They posted a video on social media proclaiming their innocence, with Boswell claiming that she and Sydney had used substances together at her home before she dropped Sydney off at a friend's house. She said they had planned to go to a casino together that weekend, but that she hadn't heard from Sydney since. The video was strange and unsettling, an odd mixture of defensiveness and false concern that only heightened suspicions rather than allaying them. Law enforcement was already piecing together a different story, one told by cell tower data, surveillance footage, and physical evidence. As the investigation intensified, the search for Sydney expanded across the rural counties surrounding Lincoln. Volunteers joined law enforcement officers, combing through fields and ditches, hoping against hope that Sydney might still be found alive. But hope began to fade as days turned into weeks. Then, on December 5th, 2017, the search came to a heartbreaking end. In rural Clay County, about 90 miles southwest of Lincoln, investigators made a grim discovery. Garbage bags had been dumped along country roads and ditches, scattered across the desolate landscape. Inside those bags were Sydney's remains, her body dismembered and cut into 14 pieces. The brutality of the discovery sent shockwaves through Nebraska and beyond. Sydney Loof, a young woman who had simply been trying to navigate the modern world of dating and connection, had been murdered and disposed of with callous disregard. The investigation now shifted from a missing person case to a homicide investigation, and all evidence pointed directly at Trail and Boswell. Cell tower data showed that their phones had been in the areas where Sydney's remains were found. Store receipts confirmed their purchase of the tools found near the disposal sites, and as investigators interviewed Trail, his story began to unravel. Initially, Trail attempted to claim that Boswell was innocent, that he alone was responsible for Sydney's death. He told investigators that Sydney had died accidentally during rough activities, a claim he would later change multiple times. But the physical evidence painted a different picture. Trail eventually acknowledged during police interviews that he had strangled Sydney with an extension cord, that her death had been violent and intentional. He admitted to the strangulation, but continued to shift his story about the circumstances and about Boswell's involvement, trying different narratives to see which might minimize the consequences. In June 2018, Trail and Boswell were formally charged with first-degree murder and improper disposal of human remains. The Nebraska Attorney General's office took over the prosecution, recognizing the significance and complexity of the case. As the legal proceedings moved forward, prosecutors built a case not just around the murder itself, but around the conspiracy that had led to it. They argued that Trail and Boswell had planned Sydney's killing before it occurred, that the purchases of tools and supplies while Sydney was still alive demonstrated clear premeditation. Additional charges of conspiracy to commit murder were added, reflecting the prosecution's belief that this had been a joint enterprise. Trail's trial began in the summer of 2019, and it was marked by shocking moments that captivated public attention. In June, Trail pleaded guilty to one charge, the improper disposal of Sydney's remains. But as the trial progressed and it became clear that a conviction on the murder charges was likely, Trail's behavior became increasingly erratic. On June 28, 2019, in a moment of explosive rage, Trail stood up in court and shouted that Bailey Boswell was innocent, that she knew nothing about his plans. Then, in front of the shocked courtroom, he pulled out what appeared to be a razor blade and slashed his own neck, cursing everyone present before collapsing. The wounds were not life-threatening, but the incident forced a pause in the proceedings as Trail refused to return to court for several days. When the trial resumed, prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence. Clerks from a hotel in Falls City testified that they had seen a woman who could have been Sydney with Trail and Boswell weeks before her disappearance, suggesting that Sydney might have been selected as a target well before her death. Surveillance footage showed Trail and Boswell checking into a hotel near the Menards where Sydney worked on November 14th, the day before her murder, positioning themselves close to their intended victim. The cell tower data, the store receipts, the condition of the apartment, and Trail's own admissions all came together to form an inescapable conclusion. On July 9, 2019, the jury took less than 3 hours to reach their verdict. They found Aubrey Trail guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human skeletal remains. Trail requested a new trial, but Judge Vicki Johnson denied the motion. The case then moved to the sentencing phase, where a 3-judge panel would determine whether Trail should receive the death penalty or life in prison. In court documents supporting the death penalty, prosecutors argued that Trail had a history of assaultive and terrorizing criminal activity, and that Sydney's murder manifested exceptional depravity by ordinary standards of morality and intelligence. During the sentencing hearing in June 2021, Trail made a final statement to the court. In a dramatic reversal, he recanted his earlier claim that Sydney had died during unusual activities and admitted that he had strangled her with an electric cord, exactly as prosecutors had alleged. He explained that he had tied Sydney up and killed her because she became frightened when he told her about his lifestyle involving fraud and group activities, that she had freaked out, and he had decided to eliminate her rather than let her leave. Trail insisted that Boswell had not been in the room during the killing and didn't know he was going to do it, but the evidence suggested otherwise. He told the court that he didn't care what sentence he received, that he was not looking for mercy or forgiveness. Judge Vicki Johnson, after considering all the evidence and arguments, concluded that Sydney's murder met the legal standard of exceptional depravity necessary to impose capital punishment. She noted that Trail had changed his story numerous times throughout the investigation and trial, demonstrating a pattern of dishonesty and manipulation. She referenced evidence that Trail had bragged about the murder to other inmates. On June 9, 2021, the 3-judge panel unanimously sentenced Aubrey Trail to death, making him one of only a handful of inmates on Nebraska's death row. Trail appealed the sentence, even requesting to represent himself, but his appeals were denied. In November 2022, the Nebraska Supreme Court rejected his appeal, affirming both his conviction and his death sentence. Bailey Boswell's case followed a separate path through the court system. She requested a change of venue due to the intense media coverage and public sentiment in the Lincoln area, and her request was granted. Her trial took place in October 2020, and the prosecution presented much of the same evidence that had convicted Trail, along with additional evidence about Boswell's role in luring Sydney and participating in the murder and disposal. Boswell's defense attorneys argued that she had been coerced by Trail, that his control over her was so complete that she was not truly responsible for her actions. They painted her as a victim of Trail's manipulation, someone caught in the orbit of a dangerous predator. But the jury did not accept that defense. The evidence showed that Boswell had actively participated in every stage of the crime, from making contact with Sydney on Tinder, to accompanying Trail to purchase the murder weapons and disposal tools, to helping clean the crime scene and dispose of Sydney's body. Cell phone records and surveillance footage placed her at every crucial moment. On October 27, 2020, the jury convicted Bailey Boswell of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human remains. Like Trail, she faced a potential death sentence, and the case moved to a sentencing phase before a 3-judge panel. In November 2021, the panel announced Boswell's sentence. While one judge believed her actions met the standard for capital punishment, The other two judges concluded that her crimes, while heinous, did not rise to the level of exceptional depravity required for the death penalty under Nebraska law. Bailey Boswell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. If she had received the death penalty, she would have become Nebraska's first female death row inmate. Instead, she will spend the remainder of her life behind bars, her youth and future erased by the choices she made in November 2017. The case of Sydney Loof resonated far beyond Nebraska's borders, raising uncomfortable questions about safety in the age of online dating and the vulnerability that comes with trusting strangers met through digital platforms. Sydney's family was left to grapple with an unimaginable loss, their daughter's life cut short by people who saw her not as a human being, but as an object to be used and discarded. Throughout the trials, the prosecution emphasized that Sydney was a real person with hopes, dreams, relationships, and a future that was stolen from her. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a co-worker, someone whose absence left a permanent void in the lives of those who loved her. The legal proceedings brought some measure of justice, with both perpetrators convicted and sentenced to spend the rest of their lives removed from society. But justice could not bring Sydney back, could not undo the violence inflicted upon her, could not heal the trauma experienced by her family and community. The case served as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind ordinary appearances, that predators can use modern technology to identify and isolate victims, and that vigilance and caution remain essential even in an age of unprecedented connection. Sydney Loof's name became synonymous with the dangers lurking in seemingly innocent online interactions, a cautionary tale that spread across social media and news outlets, prompting conversations about how to stay safe in the digital dating landscape. Nebraska rarely carries out executions, and the state currently lacks the drugs necessary to implement lethal injection, making it unlikely that Aubrey Trail's death sentence will be carried out in the near future. He remains on death row, his appeals exhausted, while Bailey Boswell serves her life sentence in a separate facility. Both have become pariahs, their names forever linked to one of Nebraska's most disturbing crimes in recent memory. The basement apartment in Wilbur, where Sydney spent her final moments, has become a place of infamy. The country roads where her remains were scattered now associated with tragedy, rather than the quiet rural peace they once represented. For Sydney's family and friends, the pain of her loss continues long after the trials concluded and the sentences were handed down. They remember her not as a victim, but as the vibrant young woman she was, full of kindness and life. They have worked to keep her memory alive in ways that honor who she was rather than how she died, though that task is made more difficult by the public nature of her case and the sensational details that emerged during the trials. The trauma of losing someone to violence is compounded when that violence becomes the subject of intense media scrutiny, when the most private grief is played out in courtrooms and news coverage. Sydney Loof's story is a tragedy that speaks to the fragility of safety and the devastating consequences when predators identify vulnerable targets. It reveals the dark potential of human nature when empathy and conscience are absent, when other people are viewed merely as means to an end. But it is also a story about justice, about law enforcement officers who work tirelessly to find Sydney and bring her killers to account, about prosecutors who built meticulous cases to ensure convictions, and about juries who carefully weighed evidence to reach just verdicts. In the end, Sydney's death resulted in two people being held accountable for their crimes, removed from society, so they could never harm anyone else. That accountability mattered, even though it could never be enough, could never restore what was lost on that cold November evening in 2017 when a young woman went on a date and never came home.